Beautiful.
Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today for the second CLE in the Business Law Section's Mental Health First Aid Series, Skills and Strategies for Handling Everyday Emotions and Stress. The Business Law Section is pleased to provide this series to support mental health and well-being strategies to its members. My name again is Lisa Walsh. I am a member of the judiciary and have been so for approximately 14 years. And on behalf of the judiciary, I can tell you that we all support this kind of programming in order to support encouraging good mental health strategies for members of the both the bench and the bar and litigants as well. Since the pandemic, even before the pandemic, but exacerbated by the pandemic, we've definitely seen an uptick in some behaviors and manifestations of depression, anxiety, general stress, working 7 days a week. So programs like this are very well received by the bench, very necessary for the bar. And on behalf of the bench, I want to thank our presenters today for taking time out of their lives and their days and their practice in order to try to help our industry. So for all of our attendees, if you have any questions during the CLE, please don't use the raise hand button. You can just put your message in the Q&A box. I will be monitoring the Q&A box. And at the end of the session, at about 50 minutes, I will run through some of those questions and present them to our panelists. We will put the CLE number in the chat at the end of the presentation, so look for that. And with that, I will briefly introduce our esteemed speakers. Dr. Kristen Jones is a licensed mental health counselor practicing in Miami, Florida. She holds a doctorate degree in health science, master's degree in mental health counseling, and a bachelor's degree in psychology. She specializes in the treatment of eating disorders, anxiety disorders, borderline personality disorder, and post-traumatic stress disorder. Dr. Jones is also the founder of Jones Mindful Living, a virtual emotional wellness program that serves people globally. Dahlia McDonald is a licensed mental health counselor. Throughout her career, Dahlia has specialized in treating pervasive emotional dysregulation and high-risk behaviors such as self-harm and chronic suicidality, borderline personality disorder, obsessive-compulsive disorder, acute anxiety, depression, and eating disorders. She has also provided intensive executive function skills training for those with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. In addition, Dahlia has advised groups in various organizations and academic institutions on using strategies for personal, academic, and professional development. So with that, our presenters will take it from here.
Thank you very much, Judge, and thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm really glad that you're here for this information. Those of you who attended our first CLE, we were talking about intense emotional experiences, crisis situations, and kind of our 911 skills for how do we deal with those. Today, we are talking about how do you deal with everyday emotion and stress. And as Judge Walsh shared with us, the legal profession does have a lot of growing challenges when it comes to mental health and stress. So what we wanted to do is give you some strategies and information today to be able to better handle those and just navigate stress and emotion that arises in everyday life. So today we're going to be talking about the importance of managing stress and emotions. We're going to be looking at healthy ways of looking at emotions and examining how do these emotions work. And we're going to be teaching you some practical strategies and skills for dealing with emotions, difficult emotions when they arise in life, especially when they may cause negative consequences for you. So let's start out just by talking about why this is important. We talked a lot about kind of major mental health struggles in our CLE, the first CLE. But what I want to stress today is the importance of preventing major mental health practices. And, what we know is learning how to address emotions in a skillful way when they arise can very much prevent things from getting much more severe. It can also obviously improve emotional balance, well-being, your just overall enjoyment in life. It can improve work performance and productivity, and it improves relationships. You know, our emotions can have a huge impact on our relationships, both professional relationships and personal relationships. So learning how to navigate them more effectively is really important for that area as well. Okay, so let's talk about stress, and I'm sure that most of you are very familiar with stress. But stress essentially is a person's physical or emotional response to demands, changes, and pressures in life. And we have a lot of common causes that we encounter daily. Money can cause stress, relationships, illness, work, technology, and social media. Now, I do just want to point to technology as a cause of stress. I think that this is one that maybe people don't fully recognize or understand, but the act of staring at a screen, this bright light, staring at a screen or hyper-focused on the screen actually leads to a mild activation of your sympathetic nervous system, which is the part of the brain that's responsible for that fight or flight response. So basically, staring at a screen leads to the brain to assume kind of a low-level threat. So when we're doing this all day, every day, that can have a significant impact on the brain. Stress can lead to a lot of challenges. It's not just, dealing with the day-to-day, but it's also just greater vulnerability overall, greater vulnerability to agitation, feeling overwhelmed, frustration, difficulty concentrating, negative mood, and it can be very challenging to relax and quiet the mind. And some other common symptoms of stress that you may experience: difficulty breathing, difficulty sleeping, fatigue, headache, muscle aches, high blood pressure, chest, congestion, indigestion, eye discomfort, blurry vision, anxiety, and panic attacks. So, we can see that it has a profound impact on our physiology and, even our physical health. So it is crucial to deal with the stress head on. And we like to think about this as emotional hygiene. So most of you, I'm sure, take care of your dental hygiene, for example. So we're brushing our teeth twice a day, regardless of how busy we are, right? And doing so helps to prevent major dental problems that can be painful and expensive. I would encourage you to take that same approach to your emotional health, because chronic stress is linked to mental and emotional and medical problems, and it can make just navigating everyday life infinitely more difficult. So here are some emotional hygiene practices. And what these do basically is it'll help to bring down the stress level, help to neutralize your nervous system, and to help reduce your vulnerability to painful emotions. So I'm going to start with kind of the big three, which are nutrition, exercise, and sleep. Most of us know that those are important and those are good for us, but they all have actually a profound impact on our emotional well-being. So nutrition, for example, we need certain nutrients for the brain to be able to produce important neurotransmitters that help us to feel emotionally balanced and regulated. So when our nutrition is off, we can be so much more vulnerable to painful emotions, and the impact of stress can be more significant. The same with exercise. Exercise really helps to promote balance throughout our bodies and minds. And studies have even found that exercise can work as well as antidepressant medications when it comes to elevating mood in people who have depression. And then we come to sleep, which is obviously a big one. I think that we all fully have experienced the impact of not enough sleep. But we do know that insomnia or lack of sleep is linked to depression and Alzheimer's dementia, among other mental and physical health issues. So those are very important, just as kind of a baseline foundation. Mindfulness, meditation, yoga, All of these, we know that they help to balance the nervous system. And we have some amazing brain studies now that show that they actually change the way that the brain responds to stimuli. So the brain actually starts to operate from a different space. So learning how to practice this not only helps us to regulate emotions and deal with them more effectively, but it also just helps to balance our nervous system. So our baseline is a bit more neutral. Time in nature. This one is important. And again, research has shown that 20 minutes in nature without distractions. So this doesn't mean sitting in nature glued to your phone, but this is 20 minutes in nature without distraction actually significantly reduces cortisol, which is the stress hormone. So that one is important. Some other ones to keep in mind are, setting meaningful goals that are in line with what's most important to you. Self-care practices like gratitude. We know that, gratitude is very important for mood. Journaling, relaxation, socializing. That one is, we are social creatures. So, socializing, engaging in that is very balancing for us. And finally, hobbies, doing things that we enjoy just for the sake of enjoyment tends to be very important. Okay, so that's on stress. And the main thing that I wanted to say with stress is that learning how to deal with that can just reduce our vulnerability to painful emotions and becoming more dysregulated. So now we're going to launch into healthy ways of looking at emotions and how do they work. So emotions are experiences that we all have. They are part of being human. Animals experience them, and they are biological. They are biological processes that are responses basically to internal and external cues. So they give our brains data, they give our brains information about how to respond to the world. And they've developed through evolution to serve very important functions. A lot of them, serve actual survival functions to keep us alive. And those emotions have 4 parts. One is cognitive. So emotions have, they come with thoughts and beliefs and expectations. And those thoughts, as we're going to talk about in a little bit, really do kind of change our emotional experiences, or they can impact them for sure. Our subjective experience. So although we all experience these emotions, we may experience them all a little bit different. And a lot of that has to do with our own biology, our upbringing, our cultures. So what we experience as pleasurable, what we experience as uncomfortable, and also intensity of emotion can vary from person to person. A big component of emotion is actually physiology. Somatic experts, people who specialize in the body's orientation to emotion, actually state that 80% of emotion is physiology. The other 20% is psychology. So our physiology actually is a huge component of our emotional experiences. And body changes like heartbeat, breathing, pupil dilation, and also brain changes are part of that. And then finally, behavioral. Each emotion has an action urge that is tied to it, an action urge, and also ways that we express the emotion. So some other parts of looking at emotions. So something to keep in mind is that emotions are not good or bad. They're not right or wrong. They just are. So they are part of us. They're biologically programmed into us. So it's important not to judge them. Also, keep in mind that having an emotion is much different than acting on an emotion. We can all experience emotion without needing to do anything. And we're going to talk more about that. Emotions are not facts. So emotions can feel very strong. And as again, we're going to talk about in a little bit, emotions can very much alter the way that we are thinking and seeing the world. And sometimes it can feel like truth. However, it's important to recognize that they are not truth. We cannot get rid of emotions. As hard as you may want to, and you may try, we can't get rid of them because, again, they are biologically programmed into us and they serve important functions. So it's important to learn how to develop a healthier relationship to them, learning how to radically accept that they exist and willingness to, interact with them in a more effective way. And finally, emotions don't last forever. So emotions are time limited, and they really act like waves. So there's a rise, a peak, and a fall. And those waves of emotions, believe it or not, last only approximately 90 seconds. So that probably sounds much shorter than most of you thought that it would, but 90 seconds. However, emotions love themselves and they can tend to be self-perpetuating. So if you have an emotion that lasts longer than 90 seconds, there is something that is reactivating that emotion. And in a minute, we're going to show you how that might happen. Oh, okay, here we go. So this is the model of emotion. I'm going to take you through it and show you all the different components. And I think that this will help to see how emotions can be self-perpetuating. So as a starting point, if you look right under the wave here, we have vulnerability factors. So vulnerability factors are what's happening in the background. So this is, everything that's going on that's making you more vulnerable to an emotion being set off in the first place. So this may be stress, right? Let's say that you're having money stress. Let's say that you haven't slept well. Maybe you skipped breakfast. Maybe you're having challenges with your child. All of these things are happening in the background and may make you more vulnerable to an emotion being set off. So this is not immediately linked to the emotion, but it's just in the background. Now, the prompting event of an emotion is something that happens. So this is the trigger. This is the internal or external event that sets off the emotion. And now we're going to go into interpretation. So interpretation is how we see or view what happened. So this is our thoughts, our beliefs, our assumptions about what happened. And this piece can be particularly powerful when it comes to our emotions. So let me give you an example. For example, let's say that I'm walking down the street and I see a colleague of mine and she doesn't say hi to me. That's the prompting event. Something external happened. Now, I may have a number of different interpretations to her not saying hi to me, all of which may elicit a different emotional response. For example, let's say that my interpretation is, Allison didn't say hi to me. She is a selfish jerk. I don't know what her problem is. So that interpretation I was kind of jumping to the negative, that may lead to the emotion of anger, right? Now, let's say the same situation happened and, I was walking down the street, my colleague didn't say hi to me. I could have the interpretation, Allison didn't say hi. I wonder what was going on. Maybe she was thinking about something, maybe she was preoccupied with something or going through something. I wonder what's going on with her. So that interpretation may lead to curiosity, concern, right? A very different emotional experience. So from that interpretation, we have our emotional experiencing. So these are the automatic biological changes that happen within you when you experience an emotion. So this may mean brain changes, body sensations, and action urges. So as I said before, each emotion has an innate action urge tied to it. Like, for example, the action urge of anger is to attack verbally or physically. That tends to be a common action urge that's linked to anger. Now, that may lead to an emotional expression. So this is the other component of an emotional experience. And this is what others can see. And these are the areas that can actually come under your control. So this is body language, your posture, your gestures, facial expressions, words, and your actions. So this is where, we have an emotional experiencing, an action urge, that's biological, that's part of the emotion. Now, acting on that urge, that is an expression, and that is something that can come under your control. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit. Now, as you see here, we have arrows moving in each direction. And what that means is each of these kind of feed each other. So let's say that I have that interpretation to Allison not saying hi to me, that, she's a selfish jerk, what's her problem? And I feel anger. Now I have the anger experiencing physiologically, and maybe I have an action urge to send an angry text, let's say, to her. Now, the emotional expression may be, physical tightness, furrowed brow, and maybe I actually send that text. Now, sending that text may then lead to more emotional experiencing, which they then lead to more emotional expression. The more intense an emotion is, the harder it is really to not act on the emotion. But this is how we can see an emotion to kind of keep reactivating. And a lot of it is when we act on that emotion. No, from this place, we can generally put a name on it. And, research has shown that just being able to label an emotion can very much help to regulate it. And then finally, we come to our after effects. So, this is what happens after we have an emotion. Memories can come up, it may lead to other thoughts. Our physical functioning may be affected. We may use a behavior, and there may be secondary emotions. So secondary emotions are essentially emotions about emotions. I'm not going to get into that so much today because that's a whole other topic. But it can bring up a lot. And then what you can see here is those after effects can then lead to more vulnerability factors, which then may make you more vulnerable to that prompting event setting off an emotion. And so this is how we see emotions kind of perpetuating and continuing, or even intensifying over time. So when we experience an emotion, something that is really important is to learn to do just that, to experience it. And research has actually shown that being able to label an emotion, calling an emotion what it is, I'm experiencing anger, I'm experiencing sadness, I'm experiencing fear, being able to label it and understand where it's coming from very much helps to regulate it. And we've also found that suppressing emotion or blocking emotion, especially chronically over time, can actually make things worse. So learning how to tolerate and how to experience emotions, quote unquote, riding a wave of emotion is key for learning to regulate it. So as I said before, emotions act like waves. There's a rise, a peak, and a fall. So learning how to surf that emotion like a surfer would a wave can, really help to just improve our relationship with our emotions in general. So when we do this, we want to just notice the emotion, observe it, but without judgment, not calling it good or bad. We can allow the emotion to rise and fall within us. We can notice our body sensations, and even putting words on that can be really helpful. I'm noticing my heart's beating fast. I'm noticing tension, or even I'm noticing an urge to do X, Y, or Z. Putting those words on it can be very helpful. Remembering that you're not your emotion. We are all humans who experience an emotion, but you are not your emotion. And having that level of separation can be really important. And then finally, we want to practice loving and respecting our emotions, remembering that our emotions are there to try to help us. They're trying to give us information to guide us. They're not always accurate, though, and Dahlia is going to share with us about what to do when they're not in just a little bit. So another piece of information that we wanted to talk about today is the importance of self-validation. And I think that this is an area that is often kind of overlooked when it comes to regulating emotion. But self-validation is essentially speaking to the emotion. So within our brains, the emotional part of the brain, the limbic system, is really the strongest and most developed. It's the oldest part of our brain. That's why a lot of times when we're very emotional, it can be hard to think logically. It can be hard to problem solve. It can be hard to, do things in a reasonable, logical way. But actually speaking to the emotion through self-validation can actually help to quiet that emotion. And the reason is, when we speak to it, which we're going to talk about in a second, basically saying, I'm experiencing anxiety right now. And you know what? It makes sense given these circumstances. When I do that, I'm communicating to my brain that, that I get it, that I've recognized that emotion, that the message has been received. And once the brain recognizes that, it kind of naturally quiets. When the brain doesn't feel like it's recognized that I haven't recognized the emotion or, the information that's trying to share with me, a lot of times it can actually get louder until it's recognized. So learning how to actually speak to the emotion can help to naturally quiet the emotion. And so that's where self-validation comes in, which is basically communicating, understanding, and acceptance for what you're experiencing. So it's acknowledging that your emotions, your thoughts, your behaviors are real, they exist, and they're understandable, maybe given your experiences. Perhaps the circumstances are something that would elicit that emotion in anybody. Given your history, maybe this is touching on something from the past, which is making this painful, or given your biology, maybe in that moment or in general, you're, more biologically vulnerable or sensitive to emotion. And what we want to do with this is really just find a kernel of truth in what we're experiencing in our perspective or in the situation. Something to recognize, though, is that validation is not agreeing, it's not liking, and it's not praise. So it's not saying, I love what I'm feeling. It's not saying I like what I'm feeling. It's just saying, I understand what I'm feeling, and maybe it makes sense given the circumstances, my history, or my biology. And, the things that are helpful to validate are feelings, emotions, opinions, thoughts, sufferings, and difficulties. Just saying, you know what, this is difficult right now. I'm having a hard time, and I get it. The facts of the situation, but only the facts of the situation. So we want to be careful not to validate the invalid. So what I mean by that, and what we're going to talk about in a little bit, is emotion can very much kind of color our thoughts. And, sometimes our thoughts may skew, significantly negative when we're experiencing painful emotion. So we want to make sure that if we are having a thought, like, let's say, for example, I don't do well on a work project, and I'm feeling sad about that, that might come with self-criticism, I'm stupid, I'm a loser, I'm no good at anything, right? I want to make sure that I validate the pain that I feel that I didn't do well. However, I'm not validating that thought that is not true and based in fact. Okay, so here are some ways that we can, in fact, self-validate. So one is just to pay attention to yourself and take yourself seriously. I think a lot of times when we experience painful emotions, we very quickly trying to turn away from it, try to get rid of it. So just taking a moment and saying, this is here and I'm paying attention to what I'm experiencing is important. Another thing that we want to do is reflect back to ourselves. So basically just describe what you're experiencing to yourself without judgment. Wow, I'm feeling really angry. I'm feeling a little nervous right now. And again, just doing that, it speaks to that emotional part of the brain, and the brain recognizes, okay, she got the message. Now I can quiet a little bit. We also want to respond in a way that shows that we're taking ourselves seriously. We're not blowing off what we're experiencing or minimizing it, saying to yourself, it's okay to feel sad or whatever you're feeling. We want to show understanding for ourselves, acknowledging that what you're going through makes sense or is understandable. And we want to look at what's actually valid in the moment. So the facts about your experiences. And then finally, showing equality. So what this means is, not comparing yourself to others in negative ways, not going into, what do I have to be upset about? There are people starving or people so much worse off. And we also want to make sure that we're not catastrophizing or fragilizing our experiences in comparison to others. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit more about thinking mistakes and the impact of our thoughts on our emotions. So as we talked about before, we learned that our interpretations can have a huge impact on our emotional experiences. So often we may encounter these things called thinking mistakes. Another word for this is cognitive distortion. But these are often habitual ways of thinking that are negatively biased and inaccurate, and they tend to really exaggerate the facts of the situation in a more negative way. And that can lead to emotions. It can lead us to react in ineffective ways. So something that's really important is to learn how to identify and recognize those thinking mistakes when they come up, and learn how to create more fact-based thoughts. Dahlia is going to share with us a skill called Check the Facts, which helps us to do that with our minds. And just keep in mind that we're much more vulnerable to these thinking mistakes when we're stressed, when we're more emotionally vulnerable. Okay, so there are quite a few here. I may not go through all of these examples. So one is called black or white, all or nothing thinking, and that's just seeing things in rigid and extreme ways. For example, if you don't do well on a project, then you're a loser who isn't good at everything. You're good at anything, right? So we're just kind of jumping to the most extreme. Another one is catastrophizing. This one's really common, especially when we're going through a really difficult time. But, we're basically only predicting worst case scenario, and we're discounting all other options. For example, if somebody's going through a breakup, they may think, I'll never find a partner. Another is overgeneralization. So we're just drawing these really broad conclusions that extend far beyond the actual situation. I had a difficult first day at work, so I'm sure this job is going to be a disaster. Emotional reasoning, taking emotions as fact. I feel like a terrible person, therefore I am. And mind reading. So you basically know what other people are thinking. For example, she thinks I'm bad at my job. Now, here are some more. We have should statements, which is just a really rigid or fixed way of thinking about how you or someone else should act. Labeling, describing things in a, exaggerated, overgeneralizing way. Personalizing, taking things personal that actually aren't. My colleague was short with me, so I must have done something wrong. Mental filter, so we're only hearing the negatives and we're kind of discounting all of the positives, and disqualifying the positive. So, finding reasons to invalidate or disprove the positives. For example, I did well on that work project because I got lucky, right? As opposed to recognizing I did well because I worked really hard on that project. Okay, so Dahlia will take it from here.
So when we're struggling with a difficult situation, our intense emotions can sometimes feel like the driving force behind our decision-making process. And it can sometimes be very difficult to make choices and take actions that are in our best interest when we're trying to manage those extreme emotions in problem situations. So we're going to discuss how you can handle these situations effectively. Marsha Linehan, the creator of dialectical behavior therapy, which is where we're pulling a lot of these skills from, outlined 5 ways that you can choose to deal with a problem. Do nothing and stay miserable, do something that makes things worse, change how you think or feel about the situation, problem solve the situation, or simply accept the situation as it is. And what makes this list useful is that it helps put things into perspective so you can be clear about how you're choosing to manage a situation and what the consequences could be. When we're experiencing an unwanted, uncomfortable emotion, it is natural to want to make that emotion go away or to do something to make ourselves feel better. So I'm going to cover these 3 skills that effectively change an unwanted emotional reaction, and we'll go into detail about more of these, about each of these shortly. So when you feel the unwanted emotion, the first thing is to check the facts. And sometimes this will be enough to create the shift that you're seeking. So if you see your emotion does not fit the facts, or if acting on that emotion may interfere with your long-term goals, you can try opposite action. And opposite action, just like it sounds, involves acting opposite to your emotions. And you have to do this all the way and repeat it over and over until the emotional reaction has changed. When your emotions do fit the facts and are justified for that situation, you can problem solve to find the most effective solution. And using this skill can help reduce the frequency and intensity of the uncomfortable emotion. So checking the facts is a way to assess whether your emotional reaction to an event fits the facts of that situation. And why do this? This process really helps you see a chain of escalation that's often feeding into your emotional response, kind of like what Kristen just went over. So you have a prompting event, then you have a thought, and then an emotion. And many times the emotions are set off by thoughts and interpretations and not by the actual events themselves. Additionally, our emotions can also have a big effect on our thoughts about the event. So for instance, this is somewhat of extreme dramatic example, but let's say my husband calls me every day when he leaves work around 6 o'clock. It's now 6:15 and I haven't heard from him. So this is the event. The thoughts could be really catastrophic, like he got into a car accident or he's having an affair with someone at the office, which would lead me to feel nervous and afraid. Any uncomfortable emotion that are, that's just unsettling to experience. Or when I don't hear from him at 6:15, I feel afraid, which leads me to have fear-based thoughts. So in this example, again, it's somewhat dramatic, but you can see how our thoughts and emotions and assumptions and interpretations of the situation are all contributing to an unpleasant emotional reaction to a most likely benign event. So the way to potentially avoid this spiraling is to check the facts, which follows this general approach. So first, you ask yourself, what is the event or stimulus that is prompting my thoughts or emotions? And here you want to only identify the facts. And you also challenge any judgments or the thinking mistakes that Kristen just reviewed. And then next you ask, what are my thoughts? What are my assumptions? What are my interpretations? Are there alternative interpretations and other points of view that I could be taking into consideration? And then you see if those thoughts and assumptions fit the facts and fit the situation. Then, are you assuming that there is a threat? Label what the threat is, what is the probability of that threat happening, and recognize what other outcomes could also happen. And you should also identify outcomes with a greater probability than the threat. Next, does your emotion, its intensity, and any thoughts fit the facts? And then lastly, what thoughts are more fitting of the facts? So you identify any other thoughts that fall into this category. When you analyze your thoughts this way, it can be very effective in helping us to change the way we feel in the moment. So, like I said, checking the facts is step one. After you check the facts and you see that your emotion does not fit the facts, kind of like with my example, or if just acting on the emotion would have negative consequences, since we all have emotions that can cause us to make choices we'd rather not make from time to time. One skill that you can use is called opposite action. So this skill involves choosing to do exactly the opposite of what your emotions are telling you to do. And this strategy can be really effective for changing the emotion you're feeling. So I believe we uploaded a copy of the quick guide to opposite action, where you have a whole list of various emotions and opposite actions as recommendations. I'm just going to go through the ones here on the slide, but you should have that with the presentation. So if you're experiencing fear, a natural urge will be to avoid or run away. So take public speaking, for instance. People can have such a visceral reaction to public speaking where the fear response is equivalent to a real life-threatening danger, as if there's a bear in front of you who's about to maul you. So in situations like that, you're obviously going to want to avoid anything that makes you that uncomfortable. Unfortunately, you won't always have the ability to avoid public speaking engagements. So this is where you would use opposite action. And this would involve first, looking physiologically and making those changes, and then behavioral changes as well. So physiologically, trying to slow down your breathing, lifting your head, putting your shoulders back, and relaxing your body, which are all opposite to what your body instinctively does when you're afraid. Then you would approach or engage in whatever you're fearful of over and over. And over time, this alters the emotional response that you have to whatever you're afraid of. So going back to public speaking as the example, people that consistently engage in public speaking do eventually become more comfortable with it by essentially following these steps. For sadness, instead of withdrawing and isolating, which again, natural action urges for that emotion, you would get active. Do something pleasant or something that increases your sense of mastery and control. Sometimes when people are sad, they may want to listen to melancholy music, but with opposite action, you would be doing the opposite by maybe blasting really uplifting songs. And then lastly, for anger, people generally have the urge to confront and attack. And this is where you can get yourself in trouble. So try to avoid that by using opposite action, which is first changing your physiological reaction by breathing more slowly, relaxing your body, maybe unclenching your jaw, relaxing your fists, and try to think about things from the other person's perspective and consider good reasons for the situation. Another suggestion, which might sound strange to some people, but you could even go as far as to do something kind for the person or just gently try to avoid them. Half smiling and willing hands are on here. These are ways to use your body to affect how your mind is reacting to a situation. So these two positions have been shown to reduce feelings of resistance and willfulness and enable us to be more open and effective in the moment. So half smiling is also known as the Mona Lisa smile, and you just slightly turn up the corners of your mouth while relaxing the rest of your face, kind of like this. And then willing hands involves putting your hands in your lap with your palms up. And this position communicates to the brain that we are in a safe place. So all of these things should result in a shift in your emotions instead of feeding into them and intensifying the emotional response. When we practice opposite action, first label the emotion that you're experiencing that's causing you the discomfort. And I know Kristen went over this, and I think this is probably a really important piece in everything we're discussing, because that will immediately make the emotion feel just slightly more manageable. So then after you label the emotion, check the facts. Is the emotion justified, and does the intensity and duration of the emotion fit the facts? So for instance, if you're in a car and someone cuts you off, feeling irritated may be appropriate. However, if you're experiencing really intense anger and having the urge to engage in road rage, this would be an example of how the emotional response does not fit the facts. So after that, you use non-judgmental language to identify the action urge. And then you ask yourself if acting on this emotion is effective in the current situation. So if the emotion does not fit the facts, or when acting on your emotion will lead to negative consequences, you identify what opposite actions would be appropriate for the action urge you're experiencing. And this is where you can use the quick guide that we've provided you with for some ideas. So then you act opposite to the emotion. And this will require you to act opposite all the way. And this means with your mind, your body, your behavior, like facial expressions, your posture, thoughts, what you say, and how you say it. So if you only do it partially or halfway, it doesn't work. And act opposite over and over again. And that consistency is what ultimately changes the emotion over time or in the moment. So when an emotion does fit the facts and the situation is the problem, something that's really helpful is trying to come up with solutions to your problem. This means that after checking the facts, you can see that the facts are the core of the problem. It's not your interpretations, not your thoughts. Problem solving is an essential skill for regulating emotions, and learning how to problem solve effectively can change difficult emotions in problem situations. So the goal isn't to just put out one fire after the next. Sometimes we need to kind of step back, look at patterns of these situations, that are leading to the painful emotions and see what we can do to prevent them in the future. And it's an effective solution. When acting on the emotion will not be helpful, even though sometimes it is. So different types of situations that may call for problem solving are listed here. You have chronic problem situations. So these would include things like financial challenges and significant debt, childcare problems, and issues at work. You have one-time problem situations, which is anything that needs to be dealt with in the moment, such as having a difficult conversation with someone, situations that you habitually avoid because they prompt painful emotions and emotions that lead to destructive behavior. So this would include avoiding speaking up for yourself, or maybe consistent procrastination with tasks and responsibilities. And if there's an emotion that you commonly struggle with and generally use destructive behaviors to cope, this would fall into this category. And then you have recurrent failures to stop destructive or ineffective behaviors such as substance abuse, and then repeat problem situations. Excuse me. So, okay, when you do have a problem to solve, you have 4 options. You can act on the emotion, you can change or solve the situation, avoid or leave the situation, or change your thoughts or interpretations about the situation. When the emotions fit the facts and are appropriate for that situation, you can act on the emotion. And it's important to remember that a primary function of our emotions is to motivate action. So sometimes our action urges are possible solutions to the problem and make sense for that event. For instance, if your house is on fire, your action urge is to run to escape. That makes sense. If you do something wrong, you apologize to make amends. Or you could try changing or solving the situation. So, excuse me, when acting on an emotion may only provide temporary relief, but what you really need are long-term solutions, you try to come up with a strategy to change or solve the problem. So for example, you have cockroaches in your kitchen, and every time you see them, you run away, which temporarily reduces the fear, but it obviously doesn't really provide you with a long-term solution. So the long-term solution would be more along the lines of calling an exterminator to prevent them from coming back altogether. When you realistically can't change the situation, you may choose to just avoid or leave the situation. So if you're trying to develop a friendly relationship with a coworker and they're just repeatedly trying to avoid you, or they treat you rudely, they're not reciprocating your attempts, you could decide to just avoid unnecessary contact with them. And then lastly, another option is to change your thoughts or interpretations about the situation. And this is obviously easier said than done, but when you can't change or avoid the situation, sometimes just changing how you think can be helpful. So one example would be you have a difficult client that you would prefer to stop working with. You could decide to discontinue working with them, or you use this as an opportunity to find the positives in continuing to work with that person. So you see essentially what that situation brings to the table and how it could benefit you in one way or another. And some takeaways from today. So emotions are part of life. They serve a very important purpose, and developing a healthy relationship with them, even the uncomfortable ones, is important. Then learning to incorporate the emotional hygiene practices, some of which Kristen reviewed, into your personal daily hygiene routine can reduce vulnerability to painful emotions and crises. Excuse me. Learning to use skill mentioned to navigate painful emotions and to deal with the difficult situations is important for mental and physical health, and will also contribute to your success in careers and relationships. And lastly, since we can't have a discussion on mental health without at least one disclaimer, if you think you could benefit from additional mental health services, please consult a clinician for more guidance and support.
Thank you. Oh, I'm sorry, Kristen.
I just wanted to share that we have our contact information here And also, if you're interested in learning more skills, I have an online emotional wellness platform called Jones Mindful Living, where we teach a lot of these skills and many, many more, and give support just to help people navigate emotions and life more effectively. So we have that information there, and then Dahlia and my practice websites as well.
So thank you both for your excellent presentation. Believe me, I was sitting and taking notes, as well as I'm sure every attendee who's on our list was. It's incredibly helpful and practical, which is right in our wheelhouse. So we do have a couple questions from our attendees today. The first is, do you agree with the DARE approach to ending anxiety, which was formulated in the book by Barry McDonough? 1, diffuse the emotion. 2, allow and experience the emotion. 3, run toward, not away from the emotion. And 4, engage in another activity.
You want to take this one? I mean, I personally think that I think it's a great approach. Is if the anxiety doesn't fit the facts, that would make sense. So if you're in a situation where you're feeling a lot of anxiety, because anxiety is a little different than fear, in that anxiety is this impending doom about potential anxiety. So anxiety would fit the facts, for example, if you're walking through a dark alley at 2 o'clock in the morning. So, it leads you to be more hypervigilant. But if the emotion of anxiety doesn't fit the facts, like there's no actual looming danger, then I think that strategy makes sense. And I think that could be effective.
And I think just, one caveat is that sometimes you're going to experience anxiety that's so overwhelming that in the moment it might not be appropriate to, I can't remember the wording because the question isn't there anymore, but to approach it, to attack it head on, that it is acceptable to distract, just to kind of make everything feel more manageable, to regulate yourself emotionally, and then, you can approach the situation again. So it might be a little bit of both sometimes.
Absolutely. And that kind of points to the first presentation we gave, that first CLE. We talked a lot about effective strategies for when the emotion is so high that it's difficult to do something, like that attendee wrote in there. The DARE technique may be difficult when the emotion is just way too intense. And so you can reflect back on that first CLE. I think it's available. I think somebody put it into the chat, and we have a lot of different strategies that can help, like distraction.
The next question is, do you recommend training an entire office and continuing educational reminders on this topic?
Yes.
That's a rhetorical question.
Yes. I mean, I think, sorry, go ahead, Dahlia. I think you were going to.
No, I was just going to say that Kristen and I had this conversation about, going back to the mental health hygiene, that we're supposed to get a physical annually. And that I think that going and focusing on mental health once a year would probably also not be a bad idea, where you're doing these trainings just to, refresh people's minds on different skills that they can be using on a regular basis. So I totally agree.
In addition, I would add that for a law firm, and I'm assuming this is a law firm, setting the tone and the culture of the firm to host and encourage these types of trainings in-house, it would be an incredibly healthy thing. So thank you both for your exceptional presentation today. Folks, if you want to check the chat, you will find the CLE number for self-reporting. Please be sure to join us for our next 2 CLEs in the series, scheduled for May 2nd and July 18th at noon. And the business law section will make registration and more details available on those soon. And finally, if you wish to view the first CLE in the series, it is available on the business law section website, www.flabizlaw.org, on the CLE tab. So thank you all so much, and thank you. Honored to have been invited to participate.
Thank you very much. It was an honor to be here.
Thank you for having us.